Welcome to Present Perfect. No grammar, but plenty of history. I'm Don Congdon, your host and guide, helping you explore how the past reaches out and touches the present. This is podcast number 124. Are you a language lover? Does learning a new word brighten your day? If so, then here's one that may be new to you: philology. It's appropriate for someone who loves words and literature because that's what it means. While it's not a term that many people use today, it's nonetheless alive and well. Ever since God confused speech at Babel, humans have been studying language so they could communicate. While almost every culture has managed to learn other languages, studying how they originate, develop, change, and function has been the province of a small number of experts. Today, we call these people linguists, but not that long ago they were called philologists. Studying language itself rather than just learning a language goes back at least 2,500 years, but the subject really kicked into high gear in the late 18th and early 19th centuries. This was a time of rapid change and an exuberant love of discovery. Science, industry, and technology were exploding. Academia was shaking off several centuries of mediocrity by revising educational systems, and philologists were starting to tackle the foundations of language. They formally hypothesized what had long been suspected. All modern languages can be traced back to common ancestor languages. For example, the European languages, as well as those of Russia, India, and Iran, were all members of what philologist and physicist Thomas Young named the Indo-European family. Later on, philologists extrapolated the existence of the original parent language, which today we call Proto-Indo-European. Although there are no written records of it, modern linguists believe that they have successfully reconstructed it. Another field that was seeing a fresh burst of activity was textual criticism. As you recall from podcast number 116, it's the field of study that attempts to reconstruct a lost original document from multiple descendant copies. Biblical textual critics use surviving manuscripts to approximate the original autographs. Aside from a strong general interest in language, textual criticism was also being fueled by recent access to a group of important old biblical manuscripts. We encountered them back in podcast number 109. You may remember that they're often called the four great uncials and include Codex Sinaiticus, Codex Vaticanus, Codex Alexandrinus, and Codex Ephraemi Rescriptus. Codex Vaticanus and Codex Alexandrinus weren't new discoveries, but thanks to photographic facsimile editions, 19th century textual scholars were the first to have easy access to them. Codex Ephraemi Rescriptus wasn't new either, but as you may recall, it was a palimpsest, a document with multiple layers of text. Constantine von Tischendorf had deciphered it in the early 1840s, so it too was fresh material. Finally, Codex Sinaiticus was truly new, having been discovered by von Tischendorf in 1844. So 19th century biblical philologists were eager to try their skills with the new material. The first step was to use these along with existing well-established manuscripts to create fresh critical texts. A critical text, as you may recall, is a composite document created from multiple manuscripts. It represents what its creator believes to be a good reconstruction of the original text. We've already discussed textual criticism a bit, but I'd like to go deeper today. Let's begin by examining the techniques that textual critics use. We'll also learn some new vocabulary. As you already know, textual criticism is a kind of error correction process that works its way back to the original text by identifying and removing problems from descendant copies. All biblical manuscripts come from the era of hand copying, so errors came into the text during the copying process. Scribes introduce errors in one of two ways. Simple errors such as additions, omissions, and alterations usually come about through fatigue or carelessness rather than intention. These are the most common changes to a text. But scribes also introduce intentional changes. In some cases, they feel that the text could be improved or made more readable by a change. Occasionally, they decide to omit or edit something. Perhaps the scribe identifies what appears to be an error introduced by the previous copyist. Altering or deleting the supposed error restores the text to its correct state. Of course, it's possible that the scribe is wrong and the correction unjustified. Occasionally, scribes alter the text because of personal dislike or to suppress something with which they disagree. History has shown, however, that these changes are quite rare and that most scribes have respected the text to the best of their abilities. Fast forward through time and you have a collection of copies. These vary in age, condition, and quality. They may also represent different scribal traditions. It's up to the textual critic to use them to prepare the critical text. Since they're representatives of the original text, critics refer to them as witnesses. The differences between them are called variants. The textual critic then chooses a methodology for using the available witnesses to produce the critical text. Historically, these have fallen into three categories. The first is copy text editing. It's the one that Erasmus used when preparing his critical text of the New Testament. It starts with a manuscript that the critic believes to be the best available. Often it's the oldest, although it may simply be the one that's the most complete or the most accessible. This starting manuscript is called the base text. The critic then examines other available witnesses and compares them to the base text. Variants are identified through a process called collation. Historically, critics did this by hand. Today, software helps identify variants, making the process faster and more reliable. The critic must then decide which variant most likely represents the original text. How this happens varies, but it's here that judgment and personal bias enter the equation. The final step is to edit the base text using these decisions as guides. The result is the finished critical text. The second method uses a technique borrowed from biology called cladistics. It attempts to reconstruct the autograph by grouping similar witnesses together into a family tree with multiple levels showing parent-child relationships. Intermediate versions can be reconstructed and the process by which the variants occurred imagined. The critic then works backwards to infer what the autograph should have looked like. The critical text is based on these inferences. If there are many witnesses, cladistics is better than copy text editing since it prevents the critic from being overwhelmed by the witnesses. The final method is called eclecticism. It takes a broad, sweeping approach by working with as many witnesses as possible. To keep things manageable and relatively objective, the critic first assembles a set of rules called canon to be followed when evaluating each witness. The rules govern how the critic must choose from amongst the witnesses and variants. Today, most textual critics follow the eclectic method. While canon vary, they usually reflect the following general principles. It's better to examine a lot of witnesses, preferably ones that aren't too closely related to each other. The more data you start with, the better likelihood you have of developing a good picture of the original text. Older is better. This principle is logical since an older manuscript has fewer copies between it and the original. Texts with fewer words are more likely to be closer to the original. Scribes add to a text more often than they subtract from it, so shorter texts probably have fewer changes. A less polished, harder to read text is better than a more polished one. This sounds counterintuitive, but it reflects a basic truth. Scribes can't resist trying to improve readability, so a more polished text probably has been changed. Beware of scribal attempts to make parallel texts like the Gospels agree more closely with one another. Consider what the majority of manuscripts say, but don't be enslaved to the majority view. It can be wrong. Feel free to reject it if there's good evidence that the minority view is better. When choosing among variants, pick the one that seems closest to the author's style in uncontested parts of the text. While some of the other rules are more complex, these give a good feel for how an eclectic textual critic works. The important thing to remember, however, is that each critical method has its problems and weaknesses, and all textual critics have biases and prejudices. A good critical text contains information that helps the reader make intelligent decisions. For example, it should list alternative readings and other acceptable variants to the main text. The compiler should explain the reasoning behind the choices used in the main text. More broadly, the compiler should explain the methodologies used to prepare the critical text as well as the manuscripts consulted. Rules, principles, and overall philosophy should be freely explained so the reader will understand the reasoning behind the production. In some critical texts, this section can be quite long, several hundred pages, and while it's usually pretty technical, it can be rather interesting too. Collectively, all of these extras are called the critical text's apparatus. Okay, enough theory. Let's take a look at some of the critical texts that came into existence starting in the 18th century. Several are direct ancestors of the ones we use today. We'll start with those of the Old Testament. While New Testament manuscripts cause quite a bit of controversy, the Old Testament is relatively uncomplicated. Almost all Old Testament critical texts are based on manuscripts from the Masoretic tradition. As I hope you recall, we discussed these in podcast number 108. The two oldest manuscripts from this family are the Aleppo Codex and the Leningrad Codex. Both reflect the Ben Asher tradition. Manuscripts of this tradition were behind the Bomberg Hebrew Bible that the KJV committee used as its critical text. Its direct descendant was a critical text developed by Rudolf Kittel in the early 20th century. Known as Biblia Hebraica, it went through two editions, one published in 1906 and the other in 1913. Before I go any farther, I'd better explain how textual scholars refer to critical texts. Rather than listing their full names, they use an abbreviation followed by a number that identifies the edition. For example, Kittel's two editions of Biblia Hebraica go by the names BH1 and BH2. I'll use this convention throughout the podcast to keep things simple. In 1937, the Bible Society of Württemberg brought out BH3, which they based on the Leningrad Codex. Most Hebrew critical texts from this point forward followed this standard, although their editors consulted other manuscripts as well. Today's most common critical text of the Old Testament is Biblia Hebraica Stuttgartensia, which replaced BH3 in 1977. It goes by the abbreviation BHS. If you study Hebrew in college or seminary, this is most likely the Hebrew Bible that you'll use. A replacement for BHS is in the works and is due in 2020. It will be called Biblia Hebraica Quinta, or BHQ. It too uses the Leningrad Codex as its base text. Given the delays it's already experienced, however, I'm not holding my breath for a 2020 release date. I should also mention that since the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls in the 1940s and the transfer of the Aleppo Codex to the Shrine of the Book in the 1980s, textual scholars usually consult these sources in addition to the standard critical texts. The New Testament is much more controversial due to a larger body of manuscripts, approximately 5,800. Textual scholars group them into three categories: the Byzantine text type, the Western text type, and the Alexandrian text type. Hopefully, you remember these from podcast number 116 when we discussed Erasmus and his critical text. I also hope you remember that Erasmus's text eventually turned into what we now call the Textus Receptus, or TR. He based it on a fairly small number of Byzantine text-type manuscripts. Until the late 18th century, critical editions of the Greek New Testament continued this tradition and were based largely on Byzantine text-type manuscripts. Most of these were relatively young, but there were quite a few of them, so scholars had a lot of data to work with. But by the late 18th century, and particularly after the four great uncials became generally accessible in the 19th, textual scholars felt that the older manuscripts should have more influence on critical texts. The oldest manuscripts are of the Alexandrian text type, but there are far fewer of them. The four great uncials are all at least partly of the Alexandrian text type. Two contain other text types as well. All four are much older than the Byzantine text type manuscripts used in the common critical texts of the previous centuries. In 1849, Constantine von Tischendorf published his first critical edition of the Greek New Testament. He continued to release new editions throughout his lifetime. As you might expect, Codex Sinaiticus had a strong presence in his critical texts. Probably the most influential and controversial of the new critical texts was one produced by Brooke Westcott and Fenton Hort in 1881. They used the copy text editing method with Codex Vaticanus as the base text. 9 rules govern their editing process. Older manuscripts were considered better, and a shorter text was preferable to a longer one. Westcott and Hort's critical text was entitled The New Testament in the Original Greek and is abbreviated WH. The longest-lived and most popular of the new critical texts first came out in 1898. It was produced by Eberhard Nestle and was called Novum Testamentum Graece. Nestle produced it using the eclectic method. He incorporated Westcott-Hort's text, von Tischendorf's, and one produced by Richard Weymouth. Nestle toned down Westcott-Hort's bias for Codex Vaticanus as well as von Tischendorf's for Codex Sinaiticus. The result was a more balanced text. He periodically released new editions with various changes and improvements. When he died in 1913, his son Erwin took over editorial duties. In the 1950s, Kurt Aland assumed editorial responsibility of the text, and it became known as the Nestle-Aland or NA text. Later on, his wife Barbara joined him in producing later editions. It's currently in its 28th edition, so NA 28 is the one that you'll see on bookstore shelves today. Nestle-Aland is usually the standard Greek text used by Bible and seminary students when they study Greek. It's also the basis for the Greek New Testament used by most Bible societies and translation groups. For example, the United Bible Society's 5th edition Greek text, called UBS 5, is essentially NA 28. A third critical text joined the Textus Receptus and Nestle-Aland in 1985. Called the Greek New Testament according to the majority text, it was produced by Zane Hodges and Arthur Farstad. Like the TR, it's based on Byzantine text-type manuscripts, but it incorporates a larger number than does the TR. Overall, it's not had a very large impact. And that's our time for today. Next time, we look at the principles of Bible translation and then move on to some significant translations of the modern era. So until next time, I'm Don Congdon, and this is Present Perfect. Have a great day. Present Perfect is a copyright of Don Congdon. Music is copyright Footage Firm Incorporated. Scripture quotations are from the New American Standard Bible, which is a copyright of the Lockman Foundation.